Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Lorber. I'm the director of Rain Taxi, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 20th Twin Cities Book Festival. We're holding it virtually this year for obvious reasons, but we're having no less fun as we do these events. We built a brand new website, so there's a lot to see on there. We have 19 of these sessions to offer you. We have several more pre-recorded sessions in our Minnesota author mashup and our new chapbook launch. And we have an incredible exhibit hall of sorts where publishers, organizations, and authors are ready to share with you what they have been up to. I hope you'll look around on the website, and I'm sure you'll find something to inspire you. I'm delighted now to introduce the authors in our panel discussion called History, Memory, and Fiction. We went kind of big with that. With me here is Tatiana Ryckman. I got turned on to her work when we interviewed her for Rain Taxi back in 2017, when her novella I Don't Think of You Until I Do was published. And her new book is the lyrical novel The Ancestry of Objects. Kathleen Rooney is the author of several books. One of my favorites among them is The Listening Room, a novel of Georgette and Lulu Magritte. She's also the co-editor of Selected Writings by Renee Magritte, and a prolific book reviewer, which I think is cool. And her latest novel is Cher and Major Whittlesey. Good job holding up these books. And David Hajdu, who nonfiction fans will know, of course, as the award-winning author of 5 incredible works of cultural history, ranging from a landmark biography of jazz pianist Billy Strayhorn to essential writings about the history of comics. And I recommend David's books highly and often to people. So I was delightfully surprised this year to learn that his latest release is, in fact, a novel, a debut novel, Adrianne Geffel. I want to remind all our viewers before we begin that you can buy books by the authors just by hitting the convenient Buy Books button down there below. You can ask questions there as well. We'd be delighted to check those out a little further into the session. And you can donate to Rain Taxi. We are a nonprofit, and every dollar we make during this festival will be used to help us start working on the 2021 festival, whatever that may look like. I'm going to be your moderator for this session, which is an honor and a pleasure for me. These were by far 3 of my favorite novels of the year. So that really was the sole criterion for bringing you together. But welcome all. And just to get us started, I avoided saying too much about the new books, so I'm going to put that burden on each of you and ask you each that sort of simultaneously awful and wonderful question: what's your book about? So let's start with you, Tatiana. What is The Ancestry of Objects about?
The workshop leader in me is like, do you mean what is it about or what happens? So what happens loosely is a woman sort of acknowledges that her life is falling apart around her, and she decides the solution to this is to kill herself, but only after she gets involved in a very ill-advised affair with a married man. But the larger themes are, what makes life worth living, and what is suffering, and what is our obligation to one another.
Wonderful. Yeah, so the small ideas there. Okay.
Yeah.
Kathleen, how about you?
Yeah, so my book is about the 2 title characters, Cher and Major Whittlesey, and it's based on a true story of World War I, and you can tell one of the characters, Cher, is a pigeon. She's a real messenger pigeon. She's stuffed and in the Smithsonian because she saved a group of soldiers led by Major Whittlesey, who were stuck behind German lines for days from a friendly fire incident. She carried the message that let the United States Army know that they were harming their own men. And so it's a book that looks at sort of their lives, both of them prior to the war, and then that incident in the war, and then their efforts mostly failed to recuperate their life after the war.
Nicely done. There's a lot to summarize there. And David, how about?
I'm going to pick up on Kathleen's cue and use a visual aid and show that my book suggests, by the 80% black space on the cover, that there's a void at the heart of the book, and the void is the title person. The title of the book is Adrianne Geffel, who's the titular subject of the book, but it's really not about her. The book is a fictional oral history about a mysterious person who disappeared, told through the testimony of those around her who knew her, worked with her from her childhood to the point of her disappearance in the 1980s. But it's a satire, so it's partly a commentary and critique of the music world and the New York culture of the 70s and 80s. It's partly an investigation of the three subjects of our talk today, which are history, memory, and fiction. It's partly about all those things. It's about the creative process, about creativity, how we respond to it as a culture. I should add that she's afflicted by an exotic neurological disorder called psychosynesthesia, and I'll tip off the people in the chat to not look it up because I made it up. And with psychosynesthesia, she hears music in her mind all the time. She has musical hallucinations that reflect her emotional state at any moment. So she hears music that matches how she feels, and she devises a way to channel that at the piano. So she's making music that's unmediated emotional expression. However she's feeling comes out. And so the book is an investigation of what happens when people make various kinds of music that expresses all the range of emotional colors, and how does the culture respond. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. One thing I love about hearing authors describe their book is it comes out very differently than us readers, who often are asked that same question when we're recommending books to one another, and trying to push our favorites on our fellow readers, because that's always the first thing they say. What's it about? And I think often we end up kind of slotting it into a type or a category. For example, I feel that with this particular book of yours, Kathleen, there's a tendency to call it an historical novel. And of course, in fact, it is based on actual history. But I've been thinking about that characterization and wonder what you think about it, because it's certainly not how I leap to describe the book.
Yeah, I think all the time about genre, because I run Rose Metal Press, which is dedicated to work in hybrid genres. And so I am always thinking about how these categories are useful as word of mouth aids, like you're saying, and also as marketing tools, but also how they're very much more porous than the labels would lead us to believe. And so I think it is a novel about history, and I don't mind if people call it historical fiction, but I think the same thing people say about like sci-fi, that it's set in the future but teaches us about now, applies to historical fiction as well. So I think it's absolutely unquestionably about a literal event that happened in World War I. But I think, Tatiana, I liked how you sort of said, do you mean what happens or what is it about? And I think when you look at what hopefully Cher and Major Whittlesey is about, it's not just World War I, but kind of about those big self-destructive impulses that people have. Like World War I was just this sort of festival of annihilation. And I think it has a lot of connections to climate change, where we know what to do, but it's a collective problem. And so it's very hard to solve, or even, I don't want to belabor a connection, but the pandemic. So just that whole thing of perhaps having a leadership that isn't doing what the people deserve. So.
Yeah, and you're absolutely forgiven for making any connection to what is going on in the world around us. But yeah, when at least in the circles I run in, if I were to say that your book is to focus on the World War I aspects, I might not do as good a job of selling it. What I've been saying is like, well, it has a pigeon as one of its narrators, and most people are like, oh, I'm in, like
Nice.
I'm ready to read that, which is certainly how I felt when I learned that. Tatiana, I've been thinking about this with regard to your book as well, because I've been fascinated by what an intense psychological study it is, and I think you alluded to that in your description. We really get into what is going on beneath the surface of this protagonist. And is that, as you wrote it, is that an element that you finessed, kind of the psychological underpinnings?
The way this book sort of came about is sort of hard to describe. Like the first draft just sort of fell out in like a 2-week period, and then it went off to sort of sat alone for 7 years, and then I dusted it off. So I would say the like what happens was very much there in the first draft, but it was in the revisions that I started thinking more about motivations and why is this character where she is today? What are some of those historical motivations, learned behaviors, things like that. So in that way, yes, that was something that I did try to pay special attention to. But I don't know, it all seems connected. It seems very difficult to separate.
Well, and when you tell us that it came out in a rush at first, that's intriguing to me, because it's obviously a very lyrical work, and at times really feels like a lot like poetry. It's often in short vignettes, and rhythm and language are used very precisely. So I'm intrigued about that composition. Do you make connections to that poetry angle?
Yeah, I do, and especially sort of the way the language works and is a little unusual throughout. I was very, very much inspired by Micheline Aharonian Markham's Mirror in the Well. That book is just phenomenal. And so after I wrote the first draft, I was like, oh, this is the poor man's Markham. But luckily distance helped work out some of those maybe too obvious similarities. But her work I really admire, because she teaches the reader how to read her work, how to read her very unusual syntax, and she does very strange things with language, and I think that's a very poetic impulse. And you mentioned my novella I Don't Think of You Until I Do, and that similarly, like when I first sent it to Future Tense to consider, I was like, I don't know if you want to call this poetry or fiction, or I don't really know what this is. And so hanging out in that liminal space is something I like.
Yeah, I'm not sure these categories are ultimately all that helpful to readers. David, your publisher, describes Adrianne Geffel as a satirical novel, and I found myself almost objecting to the term. Do you consider it satirical?
There are elements of commentary and critique in dramatic form in the book. Some of the characters and situations are designed to investigate sets of questions and ideas, not in a simplistic way. So there's an element of critique and definitely humor in much of it, but not in the entire thing. I mean, it's not like haha funny from page to page, And I'd like to think that most of the humor grows from the veracity of the characters and the situations. It's like, it's not that I'm pushing a character or a situation to a ridiculous degree, therefore it's funny, like in a clownish way, but rather that we find humor in how real the character feels. Like, oh my God, that's just like my aunt Ellen, or that's, oh my God, I knew a publicist just like that. So I'm hoping that the humor grows out of the veracity of it. But when you asked me to describe it before, I actually realized when I was finished that I didn't mention the part that I treasure most about it. I neglected to mention that at its heart, it's a kind of sweet love story.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe that's such a disreputable thing now to say, it's not a romance novel and it's not simplistic, but at its heart, there's a sweet little story of two people in love that relationship, drives a lot of the action and informs a lot of the action. And, and those dimensions of it, that dimension of it isn't satirical at all. And there are some characters who aren't the least bit comic. They're the couple of the characters. So it's a hybrid work. I won't say a mishmash because it's tightly designed, but not every page is designed to do the same thing. And there are satirical elements, but it's not a flat out satire.
Yeah. Well, good. Yeah, I found it had so much more empathy than I associate with than with satire. I think this might be a great time to just hear a tiny snippet from each of you. One of my favorite exercises with fiction is to just read a paragraph and see how it feels. And in this, in each of your cases, well, it felt great. So I wonder if you might share with our readers just a brief snippet. And David, why don't we start with you, since you just alluded to the different tones and the different characters.
Yeah.
Obviously, as an oral history, we have so many narrators, all of whom have their own perspectives. So I'm curious as to which of the speakers you'll lay on us.
One paragraph.
One paragraph, yeah.
I bet. Oh boy, I could read something that is funny, or I could read something that's sweet. Do we have a vote?
Be funny.
I like funny. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a paragraph from a Village Voice critic named N.D. Neve. N.D. Neve, and it may sound ridiculous, but it is exactly the way that all too many critics, write. So he's writing about Adrianne Geffel, and he says, "There's a kinetic audacity of a rarefied kind in Adrianne Geffel's music, an unpredictability and indeterminacy, an instability and an uncertainty that when you listen close aren't truly un nor in. Her records are free assault on everything that recording itself represents. They're not formal statements inscribed for the ages in musical notation for entombment in the great canon of canonicality. They're screams and they're whispers. They're outbursts, so vital, so mind-rattling, so fuckingly extreme that they burst out and fly straight through you and out of your room and around the whole world with so much speed and power that they come back into your house from the other direction and never knock. They're more than outbursts. They're inside outbursts, outsider artbursts. They're artsider out art, all that."
Well, thank you, and I will give you that. I'm sure many music critics felt a slight cringe as they heard themselves.
3 have emailed me and say, I'm not NDD, am I?
Yeah. Well, that raises an interesting question. I mean, I think when you write a book like this, the readers start wondering, are some of these people based on, real characters? you don't necessarily have to tell
Well,
us.
no, no, the answer is absolutely not, but that doesn't mean that there aren't bits of characters who I've experienced or thought about who don't find their way into this. So, I want to quote de Kooning. I shall quote de Kooning. As de Kooning said, every painting is a face.
Yeah.
And usually the face of the artist. So there's bits of me here and there. There's probably a bit of the worst of me in N.D. Neve. There are bits of a lot of people who I know, but it's elementally a work of the imagination. And I think to say, oh, that's such and such, and that's such and such, is a way of reducing it. And I'd say it's not so simple.
Absolutely. Well said. Kathleen, might you share with us? I guess we're going to hear either from Cher Ami or Major Whittlesey.
Yeah, so we're going to hear from Cher Ami. So this is first-person pidgin, and that kind of makes me think of the genre question that you asked, because I think something I didn't think that much about when I was writing it, but that people have pointed out to me, is it's also kind of fantastical, because the pigeon is speaking, but she's dead. So the conceit is that she's, as I said, in the Smithsonian, and so the book's kind of occasion for the telling is it's the 100th year anniversary of when she flew her final and arguably most important mission. And so she's sort of talking about the experience of being a piece of taxidermy. And so I'm just going to read this paragraph where she's kind of thinking about that. These days, the children passing by are not impressed with us. So accustomed have they become to zoos and aquariums, where they stare and stare at living animals, active and unstuffed in their cages, their tanks, their habitats. But even here, as in those places, we animals stare back. Humans make their mighty interventions in our lives, hunting, taming, training, breeding, eating, warping our bodies and instincts away from nature, toward their own ends, and they imagine that their great power puts them beyond our regard, beyond our judgment. But we observe, even as we are observed. Most humans forget that.
Oh, lovely. And that raises such an interesting question about going into the mind of an animal. Was that a particular challenge? I was reflecting that I think a lot of us, we have memories of like Charlotte's Web or our animal narrators that are comforting. And was that a challenge to, weave it into this more panoramic historical work?
Yeah, I knew early on when I was doing my research that I had to have Cher Ami's voice and I had to have Major Whittlesey's voice, and I was kind of cognizant that most people's experience of animal narrators is something that they encountered and then abandoned in childhood. And I kind of think that's unfortunate, and it's sort of a failure of imagination to think that animal voices are just for kids. And I think it's kind of a sign of human hubris, or this like residual desire to put ourselves at the top of some sort of pyramid. And so I tried really hard to make Cher Ami just like I would make any other protagonist, with a multifaceted voice, a complex backstory, desires, flaws. I didn't want it to be like a stunt narration. I wanted it to feel just as sophisticated as hopefully Charles Whittlesey sounds.
Oh, yes. And I would say you succeeded. The passage you read reminded me of advice that the poet Anne Waldman often gives to would-be writers, which is a good thing to do as a writer is to look into the eyes of an animal and think, and it is a profound exercise to do it. And so you obviously have gone very deeply into that, in that direction. Tatiana, you obviously have only one narrator that we're going to hear from, but I'm excited to dip back into her somewhat claustrophobic world.
Yeah, well, one narrator, but she speaks in the first person plural, so it's like, a whole host. But also I just wanted to mention that Kathleen's reading and your comment just now reminded me of an essay by Annie Dillard that I always want to call The Weasel, even though that's not actually its title, but it kind of ends with this moment where she...
We may have to wait to hear the end of that thought. But while we do, maybe we can continue the conversation a little bit otherwise. Oh, yeah, let's do that. And maybe stick with the juggling of different narrators, whether it's two or multiple. How do you, as novelists, shift gears?
Oh, wait. Should we wait?
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, absolutely. Tatiana, we're going to welcome you back and let you finish your thought.
I could hear you the whole time. I don't know what happened. Just Annie Dillard quietly going wild with a weasel. That's where that story ends.
Beautiful. We're still with you. Yes.
Yeah. Should I still read this paragraph?
Please do.
Okay. It was the eyeless fake dog perched on our dresser we fell in love with first. Then blankets and hat pins and vases, rusted simple machines in the garage, and the smarting of a rubber band against our wrist, and later clippings of celebrities from magazines who we thought might understand us based on certain melancholy expressions, and later still whole characters from books and the color and smell of the paper where they lived, and the moments we spent together, and finally nothing. Just a bland hunger that persists no matter what we feed it. Really uplifting stuff.
Well, it's a somewhat dark book, but a very rewarding one, I want to say. And you've already alluded to this, but I found one of the most haunting and beautiful parts of it to be how the narrator kind of relentlessly and naturally thinks of herself as we. And it is kind of vertiginous to read that way. And it's one of the reasons I made that connection to poetry. It slows us down because every time it happens, we keep sort of processing it. How did you land on that strategy to have her use the pronoun we?
That was just something that happened naturally in that first draft. It was just the way the narrator spoke in my head. And I think it was in the revision stage where I had to, remind myself this character can't just speak in we because I like the way it sounds. There's probably actually a reason for that. And that was one of the things that I really grappled with in developing the character later. I think it can be interpreted as a number of different things, but probably the most ready explanation is there are these two characters, her grandparents who raised her, who are very critical of her. And so she has sort of this constant loop of their criticisms running in her mind, and including, admonishments like, we don't do that. We behave this way, and sort of the idea of an in-group and belonging. And she's trying to parse out where her thoughts begin and the thoughts of others that she's learned, separate.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And another aspect of it that came to me, or one of the many interpretations, was the feeling that it was kind of like almost a translation. And maybe I was making a slight connection to the fact that your book is on the wonderful press Deep Vellum, which has made a name for itself as publishing translations. But there was a feeling that it was coming from a different language or coming from a different source. And I just wondered, are the influences maybe, were writers from other countries among your influences?
I wouldn't say explicitly, although I do like your point that when I think about the books that Deep Vellum has put out for the previous years before they started publishing works originally written in English, I think they, in addition to publishing translations, they also gravitate toward works that are very complicated in their native languages. and you know, linguistically, and so I do think it's a natural fit in that way.
Yeah, that's great. And David, we one person that we don't get to hear from in Adrianne Geffel is Adrianne Geffel. And of course, it's such a natural outcome for an oral history. The subject is not speaking. It fits, and yet there's an interesting tension there. As we go through, we want more and more to sort of know the real person. You know, were you tempted to write in her voice?
No. I mean, we do hear some from her in the memories of events, in the testimonies of those people around her. But I never considered her voice essential, because the book really isn't about her. It's about a world and a time, and those in the orbit around her, and how they all, without exception, with a few exceptions, saw themselves as they placed themselves in the center of her orbit. Like their view of her life and their view of in fact, their view of the time was was centered on their own experience and their own point of view. So the book is, in that way, a kind of exercise in the vagaries of memory, and a challenge. If I could pick up your question from earlier about how maybe we could how we maintained individuality of voices in a book that has multiple voices. Yeah. Did you ask about that? Yeah. I use some tools from nonfiction in my case. And when there's a character who was a state police officer in the 50 years ago, and there was a neurologist, and there was a super in a building. So I found those types of people. I gave them information, and I interviewed them. So I actually conducted interviews to have the cadence of speech in my head. Like, how does that person talk? And how would that person actually relay this specific information? I gave the police officer a scenario, and I said, now tell me this as if this happened to you. And then in the end, after I had a couple of drafts, I workshopped the whole thing like a play. And I hired a director and actors. And I had a table full of actors. And wow. They played the roles. And we were able to talk about, did all that feel true? Do you feel like she would have said that there? Or did anything ring false? So I workshopped the whole book like a play.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
I just think that's wonderful.
Expensive is what it is. It's expensive.
Yeah, you don't recommend that as a composition technique?
No. I don't know how my accountant is really not going to buy that at all. But it happened.
Wow. Well, I think that's a great window into composition, though, because while it dawned on me that certainly your career and chops as a journalist played heavily into how this book was written, you're really going much farther in saying that you practically did it that way in some cases here. Amazing. And to circle back to you, Kathleen, I want to ask a question that's come in from the audience, which is, were there historical novels that you read in the past, and maybe even as a young person, that you feel fed into the creation of this historical novel?
Yeah, I think the one that I had, well, there's two. I'm really, really interested in World War I, because I think out of all the wars, to me, it's the one that highlights the self-annihilating futility of violence of all sorts. It's hard. It was hard at the time to know why it happened, and it's even harder now looking over 100 years back. Unlike other wars, to say what started it or if there was any good to it. And so I thought a lot about Pat Barker and her Regeneration trilogy. which is an amazing set of books that sort of focus on the British participation in World War I. And she has this character, Billy Pryor, who's, you can tell even in his name, it's Pryor, but he's kind of like prying society apart. And it speaks to how, it's about the war, but it's also just about these paradigm shifts in the way that after World War I, no aspect of society was the same. And then it's also over on my bookshelf, but Sebastian Barry's A Long, Long Way, which looks at the Irish participation in World War I, which is also just like a weird thing because they're technically sort of a colony or under the rule of England. And so the Irish people who fought sort of didn't really have a dog in the fight, but were kind of fighting for other things. And so I think both of those were in my head because they're very much about World War I, but they're also about so much other stuff. So I found them instructive to not just write a historical novel, but do something maybe a little bit weirder.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And I also want to ask you the same question in terms of form. You alluded earlier that you edit the, I'm going to add the wonderful Rose Metal Press, which is a press really focused on flash fiction as a form. And I feel like you've written poetry, you've written all different kinds of work, but I feel increasingly your work is becoming maybe more dense and more panoramic. And are you, is your love of flash fiction detouring or going in different directions? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think you mentioned The Listening Room, which is this book that came out prior to this one, and it's also an animal point of view. It's partly from Georgette Magritte, Renee Magritte's spouse, and then their dog Lulu. Like a fun fact about the Magrittes is they always had Pomeranian dogs, and they always named them Lulu. So one Lulu would die, and they would get a new Lulu. And so that book also shifted between Georgette and Lulu, and I think there's a very flash element to writing something that shifts point of views because you have more beginnings and endings and more starts and stops and potential for juxtaposition. So I think, I don't personally write that much flash myself, but I think reading and editing so much of it certainly finds its way into whatever I'm working on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the same form question can come even on the level of language and syntax. In Tatiana's book, for example, one of the other really fun things for me was how the character has a habit of collapsing words into one word. So the idea of maybe not listening becomes one word, not listening. And again, it slowed me down and made me reconsider what is that new word like. So were you approaching form in that way as well? Were you looking for opportunities to play with language? I think speaking of form, it'd be a great interview if every time you ask someone a question, they just blank out. Like that's their response. But let me spin it over to you, David, because same thing. You give us an Oxford English Dictionary definition of Geffel, and I had a lot of fun with that, and just wondered where that inspiration came from.
It came from the cliche of starting with the definition that my students will sometimes do, and I'll just immediately cross that out and say that is like the hoariest, cliched way to start something.
Oh,
so that's
right.
Yeah, that's why I did it. The dictionary tells us blah 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 blah. It also gets us to the notion that she has become such a phenomenon that her name has entered the lingua franca of the culture. So that it's a mechanism for us to get into that, but it's also, I was playing with the cliche.
Yeah.
And having fun writing a definition. Tatiana is back.
I'm scared to talk. I feel like that's what triggers my banishment.
Well, we're happy you're back. Chime in.
The question was about sort of creating new words and thinking about language. And in the case of like the example you gave of not listening, this is, something that I've definitely learned from my love of Markham. But I think to not listen to something is, as two separate words. It's a little bit passive and it's sort of negating the action of listening. But to not listen is to like very actively, push something out. It sort of creates a new action out of that compound. And so I wouldn't say that I was necessarily looking for opportunities to do that because, it's fun to be allowed to do that and get away with something. But I would say that in that first draft, the language was actually much more tangled and obscure. And part of the revision process was like deciding what was there because I was feeling creative and what was there because it actually lent itself to the character and the narrative.
Great. Let me head us toward a closing with a terrific audience question, and that I think is very applicable because each of your books has it's awesome. The sounds of the city. Each of your books I consider innovative in its own way. What writer John Weidman sometimes calls experimental with a small e, and so in light of that, I wanted to ask each of you, what was the most challenging part of writing your book? And David, why don't we start with you?
I would say, but I always, came from writing nonfiction, but writing nonfiction with literary intentions. So, which is a certain, carries with it a certain set of challenges. How do you employ motifs or themes or character development, and communicate through narrative design, but honoring the truth and being factual. So with nonfiction, the challenge is how to be rigorous in your adherence to the truth, and yet be artful. So the hardest challenge I faced in writing this was how to be truthful and veracious and evoke humanity while from the imagination, while engaging the imagination, because of all the freedom that it comes with that. So I could do anything or say anything, create anything. It's like, whoa, so how do I then be true to human experience and to the heart, using that set of tools? So that was a new challenge for me and something I wrestled with. And one of the ways that I think I came to terms with it was to let some of the characters just be themselves. The book started with a set of ideas I wanted to explore and a set of questions, and it grew out of like abstractions. And then I thought I'd use some characters to explore them. And then at a certain point, the characters just became real to me. It's like they became real. And then it became just a story of those characters, and I just wanted to honor them. I just wanted to honor them, just be true to them. And it got to the point where if I saw Adri down the street on my way home, I just, there's Adri. There's Adri. I don't know if do you feel that way? Do your characters become so real to you? I wouldn't blink.
Oh,
you felt that way too, Kathleen?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
Even with a pigeon?
Yeah, I mean, and actually 2 pigeons, like there's my pigeon over there. 2 pigeons came to live and raise their babies while I was writing this. And I felt like it was the universe being like, yes, this is right. Like pigeons are like this.
That's good. And what was your biggest challenge?
I think, my biggest challenge was that World War I is such a big and incredibly sad topic that I wanted to make it very personal, but also very funny. Not, knee slapper funny or necessarily like LOL funny, but I think for me, like the things that I find the most tragic or the most moving are things that are not unremittingly depressing, but things that have comedy mixed in with them. And so I tried to show that in both Cher on Me's life and in Whit's life. And I think I succeeded. I think they're both like witty characters, and they're characters who are not, even though they've been through something pretty crushing, they're not crushed. And so I think that was something I worked on a lot in revision after I got the broad strokes of like the historical event down, was how to create those emotional peaks and valleys. So it wasn't just in sort of this tragic monotone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And Tatiana, how about you?
Right. Am I going to disappear? Can you guys hear me? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, great. Just checking. So I do think that the biggest challenge was taking a manuscript that a different version of myself wrote and making it make sense for my brain, 7 years later. I certainly hope that I've learned things and grown as a person and as a writer in that time. So doing that without making the book feel like retrofitted and sort of, cobbled together to sort of update it. And I would say one big shift in my own personal frame of mind was being perfectly content to have this like very, very despondent character just stay in it forever. And now I feel like I don't have quite as much patience for that. And, I kind of wanted it to mean more and push beyond just the depression that she's experiencing on page 1. And so making the entire book shift in that way was a challenge.
Well, I want to thank each of you for meeting those challenges, because you, in doing so, you've written books that my favorite kind of book, the book I can tell someone worked very hard on to make it as good as it is. And so I want to thank you also for writing 3 of my favorite novels of the year. Novelists out there, I know the year's not over. I'm still open to reading more, but these will certainly remain 3 of my favorite novels of the year. And thank you for today's discussion. I'm sorry we have to go, but I'm going to invite our audience again to buy your books and to keep checking out the festival. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It was
Great
nice
to
meeting all
meet
of
you
you.
both, Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you.
Hope to see you again.
Bye-bye.